This is a Saturn, and this is a Saroo, a cart that has the possibility of being an all-in-one solution for the Saturn. But can it live up to that potential? Let's find out. And welcome to Goldfish on Games. The Saroo, for those not in the know, is a cart for the Sega Saturn that allows you to play CD images off an SD card by connecting it to the expansion slot on the top of the machine. It's an open source project by TP Unix, but after being left fallow for almost 8 years, it returned in 2023, which turned it from a curiosity into something that's actually quite interesting. I got this one from AliExpress, which is where the official boards are also sold, which I've been told is from the Retro Paradise store. I got this one from KKDIY, which was highly recommended, but I've later learned that it could have some issues with updating. Fun. It came with a label and a 3D printed case that I had to assemble myself, that for the most part feels solid enough. But enough preamble, let's get this started up. It boots into this very basic menu, which reminds me of some old DOS ones, and it makes me feel right at home. Selecting a title is easy enough, and then it should just boot up the game as if there was a disc in the drive. And to test this out, I wanted to give Clockwork Knight 2 a go. The EU version starts off with this 3D animated movie, which plays flawlessly before going into the horsey main menu and eventually into the fight that you had with the last boss of the first game. Where the US version, which also had no issues in booting, had a completely different startup sequence, and then just drops you straight into the level select. Now, I've heard that the US edition was actually based on some special one that came from Japan that had the first 2 games in it, but they just locked the first one out, so now it just appears like it's only got the second. But the reason I wanted to test both of them out is that I'm actually using a PAL Saturn, as it's the only one that I have, and I thought that it might add some additional wrinkles into the situation. But I've jumped between various PAL and NTSC games, and they all seem to boot up just fine. Now, this won't magically make this Saturn into an NTSC machine, so it won't make any of those 60Hz games run perfectly fine at 50, although I am quite impressed that it just booted them up with no issues at all. But the fun did stop when I tried to play Fighters Mega Mix. And the reason for this is actually quite interesting, as the Saroo will generate a virtual memory card for every game that you run. And it's redirecting the saves to a file on the card. Annoyingly, this ends up being one single big file that will just keep growing with every game you play, rather than a single file per game. But it's a feature I'd rather have in its current state than not at all. But some games like Megamix has some issues with it, and it will crash on the beginning, but there is a workaround, and that's to hit the Z button, or Z if you like, rather than pressing A when you select the game. And this will boot you into the system menu, where you can then select Start and it will just boot up normally. And while we're talking about the SD card, let's take a quick look at the setup. The card should be formatted in FAT32, and after getting the latest firmware from the GitHub page, you should place the ramimage.bin file and the saroo.config.txt file in the root, and then make a Saroo folder under which you'll then place the updater and ISO directories. And the ISO folder is where the games will go. What you should be doing is then creating a folder per game and then putting the bin and queue files for that game under it. And note that you can't actually put ISOs in the ISO folder, it's just bin and queue. But I want to point out as well that this has just changed with the very latest version of the firmware that's just come out, and they've made it a lot easier to set up this directory structure. The device will default to Chinese as its language, so you might want to change that, and that's done via that text file. It has a few options in it, with more coming, and the comments are in Chinese, but they are for the most part self-explanatory. And with all that covered, let's boot up a few more games. I found out that there is some unofficial compatibility lists going around that will give you an idea of what will and won't work, as not everything is running yet. And for some games you'll need to apply some additional tweaks to get them started. And this is partially due to one of the features of the Saroo, and that is that it tries to load the games quicker than it could from the drive, but some games, they don't like that fast loading. So some of the tweaks are actually slowing it down, so those games will load. And just how much quicker do those games load? Well, I recorded a few direct comparisons so we can take a look at them. Now this will be a PAL CD versus a PAL disk image, so it will be as direct as possible. And those discs are as clean as I can make them. But those CDs, they're not all in the best condition. So you might want to take some of those results with a tiny pinch of salt. And thus they might be a bit slower than they were if they were new. But to be honest, I think that tends to be a plus for these sorts of devices, as you don't have to worry about what the previous owner might have done with that media. They might have used it as a plate or as a dog chew. Doesn't matter anymore, as those disk images should be perfect. But there's also the possibility that your laser might be on the way out as well. And while that might hold the original media back, I don't think that even if everything was brand new, we would have gotten anywhere near close to some of the speeds that we're seeing from the Saroo. Some of those load times are absolutely amazing. But I will say, for the most part, the Saturn didn't have the worst load times ever. It's not a Neo Geo CD, but it does get you into the game so much quicker for something like Mortal Kombat. That really had some bad times, and the Saroo really seems to help it out quite a bit. Now you might be asking, why this over the other options? The only other one that I personally own is the Pseudo Saturn Kai, and while it's very cheap and it works, you do need to burn CDs, and it's best if you use decent quality blanks, which are getting a little bit harder to find. And obviously it still relies on the drive in the machine being in good working condition. The closest similar device would be the Satiator, and it uses the video card slot on the back of the machine. And while that looks amazing, it is also 3 times more expensive. The direct drive replacements like the Fenrir do look quite good, and they don't cost too much more than this. But it does require you to open up the machine, and it doesn't have memory card or RAM expansion support built into it. With this, it's a plug and play device. Now I have been looking at getting myself a Japanese Saturn, as I want to get an NTSC machine, and those grey machines, they look quite nice. And it would match the mini Saturn that I built the other year. So this cart would make it really easy to switch between the two machines. Now I want to dive into one of the other points that I just made, and that is that it supports being a 1MB or 4MB expansion card. And I tested this with Metal Slug, that from what I understand requires the 1MB expansion, and it ran great. Or at least well as an NTSC game would run on a PAL machine, with the odd slowdown here or there. But Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter had issues. I couldn't tell you if it was a problem with the memory expansion, the drive emulation, or the fact that it's a UK machine, or some combination of the whole lot, but there are obvious problems here, with sound stuttering, and I think I spotted some graphical issues. Now, I'm no expert on the Saturn, or its RAM expansions, so there is a chance that I've messed something up in all this. But wait, there's a new challenger! As I now have a Japanese Saturn. As this video took much longer to get out than I expected, and this one has now arrived. And it's been modded for 240 volts and features a region-free BIOS. And unsurprisingly, the Saroo works great with it, which I've also upgraded to the latest firmware. And look at this now, Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter works fine. I can only assume it was some kind of compatibility issue between the regions, but it's awesome that it's now working. But on that subject, what is its general compatibility like? And I'd like to say it's good, verging on great, but still a long way off from amazing or perfect. And while I like to say that most of the games I wanted to play booted up and had no issues, apart from stuff like Fighters Megamix, there have been a few that would just outright fail to even load, and it would just sit here on the main menu. Now, sometimes restarting and then selecting the game again would get it to work, but others, this would be all you would get. And some of the other titles might look fine until you're in the game and then it will crash. When these problem games are found and reported, they are being looked at, and new timing tweaks are being released to try and fix them. But it is on a case-by-case basis, with users having to report them, and then possibly trying out timing changes themselves, or waiting on updated configuration files. Something I've also noticed in the month or so that I've had this cart is that the console won't always detect it on boot, but normally a quick reset and it will be absolutely fine. This means the Saroo isn't perfect, but for me it sits in that nice price-feature support balance, and I'm fine with its shortcomings at the moment. But there is a chance that its development might stop again. But hopefully there is now enough interest in it that other people are joining in and trying to help out with the development efforts, so I am confident that it will continue. It would also be nice if some of those fan-made support threads and compatibility guides became official and joined the GitHub. That would help a lot. But who knows what 2024 might bring for this card. Even if it doesn't get any more firmware upgrades, I think this is in a usable position for me, even if there are a few areas that need work, as I've seen some talk about adding support for changing CDs. But as I've not played any of those games, I've not got any experience with it. As I've said, I've only had this cart for about a month, so I'm still learning and messing around with it. So if you have more technical questions, I might not be the best person to ask, but I will try my best. But remember, that GitHub page is probably the best place to go to, even if it might take a little while to get any response. Now, this isn't normal for the typical content that I make, as I tend to do game reviews or look at random hardware. I mostly made this as I had quite a few people asking me about the Saroo, and I thought a video would be the best way to respond. So hopefully this has been useful, and I can get back to making random reviews, and who knows, there might be more Saturn ones in the future. I promised to look at Clockwork Knight 2 when I reviewed the original way back in 2018. Yikes, where's the time gone? And while I contemplate my age, I've been the Goldfish, that was the Sega Saturn Saroo, and this was Goldfish on Games. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video if you've made it this far. I don't tend to do reviews or videos on these sorts of devices, so you won't find too much in my back catalogue. But what I do like to do is reviews of games and other random hardware. So if that interests you, then you can check out 2 videos that are linked on the screen right now, or you might consider subscribing.